Hello. So I want to talk about this theory of Atlantis being in Scandinavia and realize, of course, that many of you find this. I already knew, of course, that you would find this very weird. I still do, even I. But there are, of course, many of you who believe that Atlantis is a continent, that it is Africa or America. And I can see in the analytics that some of you left when I said that a continent can't be an island. And I just want to make it clear that I'm not arguing against any other theory. Actually, I'm not here to argue. I'm only here to discuss this work, right, of 2,200 pages, which is a shit ton, right? And yeah, that's basically all I'm here to do, actually. So if I came off a little polemic, that was not my intention. So why is this weird? First of all, it's 300 years old, so it's based on biblical timelines, with civilization starting from the Great Flood. Instead of today, we're starting it with the end of the Ice Age, right? And what is interesting is, of course, that the same evidence that we use for the Ice Age is the same evidence that they used for the Flood. And they used the biblical genealogies to create their timelines. And I'm going to do a deep dive on how he synchronizes the sources, and that there are quite a few synchronizations happening, which is actually in real antiquatorial history, that is actually still the main method of seeing if a theory works, synchronizing sources and see if they land pretty much on the same dates. That is how he creates his timeline here. And of course, this is 300 years old. Timelines were not as they didn't agree on timelines as much as we do today. Today we have we think we know where we start and where we are today, right? We have the dates pretty much set today. It was not the case in his time as much. So that might be striking as very weird for us today, who are so used to or take for granted that the timeline is set. Everybody agrees on the same timeline today. And another weird thing is, of course, that Atlantis here is a peninsula, which might strike you as just trying to make Plato's descriptions into something that you want it to be. That Ludvig would be so nationalistic that he tried to make the descriptions fit his homeland, just because his love of his homeland. What I can say about that is that the word Nisos, which means island in Greek, can be applied to peninsulas. For instance, the Pelops island in Greece, is a peninsula, but its name is the island of Pelops, even in Greek. But it is a peninsula, showing how this term can be somewhat loosely applied. And also how the ancient texts of Plato and such forth are not, they're not strictly scholarly as we see it today, right? It was more loose, the definitions of what was what. They could blend history, philosophy, allegory into one work. Why there basically simply has to be some wiggle room in where you believe there is parable and where you believe there is not parable. You just have to argue your case, right? I will say right a lot. I'm working on it, but in the meantime, while I learn, you can take a shot for every time I say it, I guess. So, yes, and then there's the flood, of course. Ought not Atlantis to be sunk and disappeared? The first argument against that from the text is, of course, that the Atlanteans fought with the Greeks. So if this was 9,000 years before Solon, Greeks did not exist back then. So how did they fight with the Greeks? That speaks for them existing after the flood, right? Existing at the same time as the Greeks. And also, Rubik shows how floods and basically natural disasters and large happenings in text are usually used to describe armies and such forth. Armies and strong individuals are usually likened to natural phenomena, which they of course saw as the most powerful things in the world. It was popular to liken powerful individuals and armies and so forth with these kind of natural phenomena, earthquakes, storms, and floods as well. I will delve into this maybe in a month or something. I will show these sources in antiquity which describe natural phenomena this way, or armies and powerful people, liken them to these natural phenomena. So, unfortunately, you guys can't read this right now, most of you, because it only exists in Swedish and English. This is a printed later version, printed in the 30s, here in my hometown of Uppsala. And I'm working on translating these firstly into modern Swedish, right? Because this is hard even for me to read. And then I hope that it won't be too much work translating it with the help of AI into English. So that you can also read this thoroughly and hopefully can have a great discussion about this theory, because even though it's a kind of a laughingstock, there are even scholars in Sweden who are adamant that Rubik is actually quite rigorous in his work. And he is, I mean, he was a Renaissance man of his time. He's very famous in Sweden, actually, kind of iconic in academic circles for his rigorousness. But it is 300 years old, so standards have changed, of course, when we've learned new stuff and new things have been found and so forth. And there are a lot of premises which we just don't agree with today. And where it lacks the most is probably in its linguistic arguments. There it can be you can make everything fit if you want to in linguistics, right? So that might be where it hangs the most loosely, this work. But it's actually based on the Gothicist argument that the Goths and the Scythians are, first of all, like a forefather of the whole European peoples, and that basically the whole Indo-European family is quite connected, actually. And Rubik believes that a core of these large European peoples come from Scandinavia. That's what this work is based upon. So if you can prove this, then the linguistic arguments become more plausible, right? This is the foreground for the linguistic arguments on top. And this is also how Rubik conceptualizes it, that there's a base and then there's walls, and then on top there are the decorations, which is basically the linguistic arguments. The problem is that, especially when it comes to the gods in this work, he claims that the Greek gods and many other gods are from Scandinavia, and these arguments are very often linguistic. And that becomes very flimsy pretty fast. It really does. So my work will be a lot of analyzing these linguistic arguments. You will see me even analyzing. If you saw my last video on why Atlantis is not a continent, you saw me do a word-for-word translation just to see. I will do that a lot just to see how Rubek made his interpretations. That will also be a thing I do a lot. And when I come to talk about the gods, there will also be a lot of linguistic analyzing, because he also does not always argue for why he interprets one word as being the same as in another source. He just basically implies it, right? And today that would not fly at all. Just implying stuff. You have to be very clear how you came to your conclusion. And that is, I guess, one of the larger flaws in his work also, that flaws in a way, but also just because times have changed, right? Standards have changed. And in his time, it was pretty much standard to just switch the word into what you ought to believe it was in actual fact. We don't do that today, of course, probably for the better. So that will also be a lot of analyzing I do, trying to see what his reasoning is, why he switched one word for the thing he believes it ought to be instead. And it's of course through the lens of Norse mythology and language and culture that he does, because he believes that the Indo-European families come from Scandinavia in the beginning. So yes, I believe I've talked about. I guess I could go over a little bit about what the books are about. So the first one is about 600 pages and mostly goes over the why all the or how all the mythical lands of Ogygia, Atlantis, Hyperborea, and myriad of other names, Scythia as well, that all of these names describe one place, and that is Scandinavia, and also how a lot of the barbarian tribes also come from here. The Gauls, the Scythians, and also Greek place names, which are thought to be mythological today. For instance, Eridanus, and the myth of Phaeton, the sun, of course, as well. Speaking of Phaeton, so the first book is basically about lands and peoples and how they are from Scandinavia. And the second book is more about, for instance, Phaeton and sun symbology and earth symbology, as well as moon symbology. Basically how Scandinavian worship of the earth and the sun and how the sky revolved around us here in Scandinavia, how that is mirrored in mythologies outside of Scandinavia. The amount of sun years, or I'm sorry, the way the sun goes around, revolves around in the year. For instance, in Egyptology, he claims that the descriptions of the sun simply doesn't fit the way the sun revolves around in Egypt, but fits how it revolves around Scandinavia. The sun dying and rising up again, right? Which is also, of course, the Jesus story. He believes that the sun dying and rising again is northern mythology and can't be anything from down south. If they have it down south, it has to come from the north. It can conceivably, of course, come from the South Pole as well, but there simply is no source describing a very old people coming from the South Pole. They describe them coming from the north, right? And I'm almost finished with the second book. I've been stuck on this book for almost a year now, actually, because I've decided to do some presentations and begin sharing this information, and that made me have to go back to book number 1 again to go everything over. It's quite frustrating, actually, to not being able to continue reading this work. I really want to finish this to get a overall picture of everything, but I guess I'll just have to be patient. I actually think right now that it will be 8 more years before I understand this work to a very good extent. I've been doing this for 2 years now and feel like I'm not a beginner anymore, kind of an intermediate, I guess. So in maybe a year, maybe a little shorter, I hope to get into the third book. And the first one was about, or is about, how the lands and peoples are from Scandinavia. The second one is more about earth worship and sun worship, the cultures around Europe and the Near East and Asia, how their mythologies and worships are influenced by Scandinavian cultures when they moved to these areas. And the third one is about the exoduses from Scandinavia and how they got there, basically, all the way from Scandinavia down into India. So this one I'm actually really looking forward to reading, how he interprets or comes to the conclusion how they moved. And he uses a lot of mythology there as well. And the fourth one, it's a very short one. He had a lot more written, but it was sadly lost in the Uppsala fire in 1702, when basically the whole town was burned down, including his work and everything he'd done. This was all that was left, this book. And I think it mostly tries to tie the biblical narrative into his work to show how it is real, in his opinion. As I'm an atheist and at least grown up being very skeptical of the Bible, today I believe the Bible possibly can be a quite good source, actually. So yeah, I will look forward to reading that as well and see what his arguments are for biblical happenings being real. And then, of course, how Egypt is much younger as well, fitting more the biblical timeline more than we do today. But I think I will stop there, because now I've given you some of just general thoughts about the work and how this theory is very weird, of course. It goes against pretty much all modern Atlantis theories, and it went against pretty much everything in his time as well, right? It was weird in his time, and it's even weirder today. But I think there's a lot to learn from it, actually. I do. I like Michael Bessarian's work of The Occult History of Ireland, and Logos, of course, is incredible. I've re-uploaded his video on the Goths being Scythians and being like a forefather for the whole Indo-European tribe. If you haven't seen that video, I implore you to watch that video, because that video is basically the base for this work, right? If that theory is true, that the Goths are the Scythians and is like a whole father for the European peoples, then this becomes all the more likely. There are a myriad of theories of where the Goths and the Scythians come from. This is just one theory, of course, but yeah, this channel is for exploring this. So yeah, thank you. I'll see you in a few days when I come up with the next video.